You turned off my sprinklers in the middle of a garden party, and now my hydrangeas are dying," she screamed while stomping across my yard in high heels, holding a dripping wine glass and a busted garden hose like it was a murder weapon. I stood there, holding a shovel, blinking through the dust and mud I'd just dug up, trying to decide if I was hallucinating or if the HOA president had actually just called the cops on me for digging a trench in my own backyard. 2 officers were already on the way, she said, and if I didn't fill the trench right this second, she would press charges for destruction of community property. Except there was one massive problem with her story. The pipe she claimed was community-owned was not only undocumented by the HOA, it was running directly under my private yard and illegally hooked up to her irrigation system. And the best part? I had just shut it off at the source. The day had started innocently enough. After weeks of watching rainwater pool into a swampy mess behind my garage, I finally carved out time on a sunny Saturday to trench the yard and install a French drain system. I'd planned it out carefully, had all the permits, and even flagged utility lines ahead of time. The project should have taken a day or 2 at most. The last thing I expected was to uncover a plastic PVC pipe that clearly didn't belong there. It didn't match any of the flagged lines, wasn't on any utility schematic, and definitely didn't have a right-of-way agreement running through my land. I followed the pipe like a curious archaeologist, only to realize it stretched clean across the property line and snaked into the backyard of none other than Penelope Winthrop, HOA president, self-declared guardian of all things aesthetically conforming, and an absolute menace in linen pantsuits. When I turned off my main valve to investigate the pipe safely, I heard it, the distinct sound of sprinklers wheezing to a stop. Then came the screaming. Penelope was mid-soiree in her backyard with 3 other HOA board members and a catered wine and cheese setup. Apparently, her lush lawn and delicate rose beds had gone dry the moment I shut off the valve. I barely had time to stand up before she came marching across the grass like a furious wine-soaked general. She didn't knock. She didn't ask questions. She accused. Loudly. I tried to explain. I told her I found an unauthorized line on my property and had shut it off to investigate. She didn't want to hear it. According to her, I had destroyed community infrastructure and sabotaged a public irrigation system that the HOA had relied on for years. The thing is, I'm an engineer. I know a jerry-rigged pipe when I see one. And this wasn't installed by a utility company. The fittings were cheap, the layout was amateurish, and it was clearly hidden underground with the intent of not being found. That's when I realized, Penelope wasn't mad because her party got interrupted. She was mad because I had found her secret. She whipped out her phone and started yelling at dispatch like she was reporting a national emergency. I stood there, muddy and confused, watching her pace in tight circles on my grass while spouting off nonsense about how I was tampering with regulated systems and how she'd be pressing charges. Then she looked at me dead in the eye and screamed, "You're going to pay for killing my lawn." At that point, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera app, and hit record. The police arrived 10 minutes later. 2 officers in a cruiser rolled up just as Penelope was now sitting on my porch, still yelling into her phone, now talking to someone on the HOA board about emergency bylaws. I waved to the officers and calmly walked them to the trench, showing them the pipe, the water shut-off valve, and my marked property lines. I even showed them the city permit I'd pulled for the trench work. They looked at the pipe, scratched their heads, and asked if it was on any official utility map. It wasn't. One of them let out a low whistle and said, "Looks like someone's been siphoning off water for a while." Penelope tried to interrupt, but the officers weren't interested in HOA politics. They said it was a civil issue, not criminal, and unless someone could prove I'd done something illegal, which I hadn't, they were leaving. Before they left, one officer asked if I'd considered installing security cameras, especially if the HOA kept pulling stunts like this. I told him I was already on it. After the cruiser pulled away, Penelope stood in the middle of my yard glaring at the pipe in the trench like it had personally betrayed her. She muttered something about repercussions and board meetings before storming off without another word. I didn't say anything. I just smiled, grabbed my shovel, and kept digging. The next morning, an official-looking envelope from the HOA was stuck in my door. It claimed I had violated Rule 43B, something about unauthorized earth alteration. The fine was ridiculous, $200 per day until the trench was filled. I laughed. Rule 43B didn't exist in the HOA handbook. I knew because I'd read the whole thing after moving in, anticipating this exact kind of nonsense. The letter was fake, probably drafted by Penelope herself, and likely meant to intimidate me. I decided then and there that if she wanted to play games, I'd play back. Only I'd do it by the book. I called my cousin, who worked at a law firm downtown, and asked him to draft a formal cease and desist letter citing property rights, trespassing statutes, and the potential for civil damages if the illegal line wasn't removed. The letter was mailed with tracking and a return receipt. I also contacted the city's utility inspection department and requested a site review. Within 48 hours, I had a reply. They were sending someone out to assess the line. 3 days after the trench incident, I thought things might cool down. But if there's one thing I've learned about HOA tyrants, it's that when they lose control, they don't retreat, they double down. I woke up that morning to find another bright orange notice taped to my front door, this one looking slightly more official than the last. It claimed I was now in violation of an emergency amendment passed by the HOA board regarding unauthorized excavation. The fine had jumped to $500 per day, and the notice warned that escalated legal action was being considered. The kicker? It was signed by none other than Penelope Winthrop, self-proclaimed president and now self-declared judge, jury, and executioner. I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you realize the game just got dirtier. Knowing how these HOA clowns operated, I decided to attend the next board meeting. I'd kept to myself since moving in, hoping to avoid suburban politics altogether, but Penelope had pushed things too far. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige stucco building with artificial plants and folding chairs that tried their best to feel official. Penelope sat at the head of the table, wearing a lavender blazer and a smug expression like she already knew she was about to win something. The other board members sat quietly beside her, 3 of them clearly her yes-men, the 4th looking like he regretted every life choice that led him to that moment. When public comment opened, Penelope tried to skip over my name, claiming it wasn't a proper agenda item. But I spoke anyway. I stood up, introduced myself, and laid it out plainly. I explained how I'd found an unpermitted pipe buried beneath my property. I explained that it connected to her home, fed her irrigation system, and bypassed any visible water meter. I showed them the photos, the utility maps, and the inspection results from the city. A few of the residents gasped audibly. The board members exchanged nervous glances. One of the men who'd always voted in lockstep with Penelope suddenly leaned back in his chair like he wanted no part of this mess. Penelope, unsurprisingly, tried to turn it all around. She claimed I'd misunderstood the situation, that the pipe was historical infrastructure left over from the development phase of the community. She even insisted that I had no right to dig without HOA authorization and that I was defacing the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. I countered by pointing out that nothing in the HOA charter gave them authority over private utility installations. That's when I pulled out the survey. I had a certified property boundary document proving the pipe was entirely on my land. No shared easement, no gray area. Dead silence followed. But Penelope wasn't done. She slammed her gavel like she was presiding over a courtroom and declared the matter under review. The room erupted. Several residents stood up and demanded answers. One elderly man asked loudly, "If it's historical, why does it go to only your house?" Another woman said her water bill had gone up inexplicably in the last few years. The seeds of doubt were spreading faster than crabgrass. Penelope declared the meeting adjourned and stormed out, knocking over a chair on the way. I gathered my documents calmly, smiled at a few neighbors, and walked out into the night feeling the tide turning. The next morning, things escalated again. I was drinking coffee on my back porch when I heard what sounded like metal scraping against the side of my house. I walked around to find a small signpost being driven into my lawn. It read, "Under HOA enforcement, do not disturb." A hired security guard, dressed in a laughably oversized vest, was hammering it into the ground. When I confronted him, he muttered something about being told this area was under dispute and that Ms. Winthrop gave him permission. I told him flat out to remove the sign or I'd report it as trespassing. He hesitated, looked nervous, and then left. I ripped the sign out of the ground and tossed it onto the sidewalk in front of Penelope's house. Later that day, I started getting texts from neighbors. People who had previously kept their heads down were now openly siding with me. Some shared stories about their own run-ins with Penelope. Unauthorized fines, threats of foreclosure over mailbox colors, even accusations of stolen plants. One neighbor, Pete, who lived a few houses down and had been in the neighborhood for over 20 years, offered me something unexpected. He handed me a dusty manila envelope filled with old HOA documents. Among them was a 10-year-old utility map of the development before it was completed. I scanned it and immediately noticed something odd. The original map had water lines clearly marked, but there was no indication of a line running through my property. In the corner, however, someone had drawn an extra pipeline in red ink, with the initials PW scribbled beside it. That was the smoking gun I needed. Armed with more proof than ever, I reached out to a contact I had at the local paper, a freelance journalist who occasionally covered zoning disputes and neighborhood corruption. She agreed to meet and, after seeing the documents and the footage, said it was exactly the kind of absurd but true story readers devour. She asked if she could publish it. I said yes, but asked her to blur my address and name in the article for now. I wanted to see how Penelope reacted when her lies became public record. The article dropped 2 days later. The headline read, "HOA President accused of secret water diversion, neighbor discovers unauthorized line beneath yard." It had everything. A viral video clip of Penelope yelling into her phone, photos of the trench, utility maps, and expert commentary from the city inspector. The article spread like wildfire. My phone blew up with messages, not just from neighbors, but from other residents in nearby HOA communities who'd had similar run-ins with rogue presidents. Penelope's carefully curated image of suburban perfection was unraveling by the hour. That night, I received an unexpected visit. Pete and 2 other residents knocked on my door. They asked if I'd be willing to attend a private community meeting, unofficial but organized by residents who wanted to confront Penelope directly. I agreed. The next evening, about 30 people gathered at Pete's garage with folding chairs, pizza boxes, and a shared sense of indignation. For the first time, I saw how deep the resentment ran. People were tired of Penelope's unchecked power, tired of the manipulation, tired of being silenced or fined for stepping out of line. The group decided they would push for a formal recall vote. Pete, who had served on the board years ago, knew the process and had already prepared the paperwork. The plan was to submit it the following week. Meanwhile, I was to continue documenting everything. If Penelope retaliated again, it would only strengthen the case against her. The irony wasn't lost on me. This all started because I wanted to stop a little backyard flooding. Now I was at the center of a movement. When I got back home that night, I checked my security footage out of habit and caught something strange. Around 10:42 p.m., a figure had crept up to the trench and poured what looked like mulch into it, an attempt to cover the exposed pipe, perhaps destroy evidence. But they weren't careful. The figure tripped, fell into the trench, and scrambled out, limping as they fled. I zoomed in. Even in the poor lighting, I could make out the patterned scarf Penelope had worn earlier that day. I sat back and smiled. She was unraveling. It was no longer about a pipe. It was about control, accountability, and the lengths someone would go to keep their grip on a fake throne built out of fear and HOA letters. Penelope had tried to drown me in bureaucracy, but I'd handed her the shovel, and she'd started digging her own trench. By the time the weekend rolled around, the trench was no longer just a hole in my backyard, it was the battleground of a quiet war. The article had stirred up more than just neighborhood chatter. City officials were suddenly taking notice, the HOA board was under pressure, and Penelope was clearly cracking under the weight of her own lies. I hadn't heard from her directly since the midnight mulch stunt, but the silence wasn't comforting, it was ominous. People like her don't vanish quietly. They plot. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of heavy machinery. At first, I assumed it was more city work down the block, but as I walked out to my porch, I froze. A small construction crew was unloading equipment right in front of my yard. A bobcat skid steer, a portable fencing unit, and a man with a clipboard. I walked over and asked what they were doing. He looked confused, then told me they were instructed to fill and reseal a trench for HOA code compliance. I asked who hired them. He flipped through his sheet and pointed to a name at the top, P. Winthrop. The man wasn't rude, just doing his job, but he clearly had no clue he was being used as a pawn. I told him flatly that he was on private property, showed him my deed, and explained the situation. He backed off quickly, realizing he was stepping into a legal mess he wanted no part of. The crew packed up without argument, but the damage was done. Penelope was escalating. She wasn't trying to fight through board meetings or formal channels anymore. She was trying to rewrite reality in broad daylight. I filed a trespassing complaint immediately. I also emailed the incident to the city inspector who had visited earlier. Within an hour, I received a reply that he was forwarding the case to the city attorney's office. That same day, I made sure to install an extra 2 security cameras, one facing the trench and another angled toward the sidewalk where any late-night saboteurs might creep through again. I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was documenting every step, every lie, every bad move. That afternoon, I decided it was time to dig deeper, literally. I rerouted my trench around the exposed pipe and began uncovering the full path of the illegal line. As I worked, I started noticing strange inconsistencies. The pipe wasn't just a simple water line. It had multiple junctions, shoddy connectors, and evidence of patchwork repairs. At one point, I even found a buried shutoff valve installed inside a piece of hollowed-out lawn edging, a deliberate attempt to hide it from sight. Whoever had installed this wasn't just being sneaky. They knew what they were doing and had planned it meticulously. The final stretch of pipe led straight into the rear corner of Penelope's yard. Not into a garden or lawn, but directly into a sprinkler control unit, one I recognized from a brochure because it was a high-end, Wi-Fi-controlled irrigation system. A system that should have been running off her own meter, not siphoning water through my property. With gloves still on, I took a series of high-resolution photos and sent them to the city inspector, this time attaching a clear note. Full pipe route traced. Direct connection confirmed. Around sunset, I received a call from Pete. He was practically giddy. The recall petition had reached the required number of signatures in record time. The neighborhood was more than ready to oust Penelope, and the board was now legally required to hold a vote within 2 weeks. He also shared that 2 of the board members had already resigned quietly, afraid of being caught up in the fallout. That left Penelope, one nervous holdout, and Pete himself, who was now seen as the likely replacement if the vote went through. I congratulated him, but we both knew the hard part wasn't over yet. Penelope was cornered, and a cornered HOA Queen was a dangerous creature. The next morning, I received another letter, hand-delivered and unsigned. It was printed on faux parchment paper with legal-sounding language, but no actual legitimacy. It warned me of potential litigation for slander, defamation, and libel against the HOA. I recognized the writing style immediately. It was classic Penelope, fluffed-up jargon with no legal basis, meant to sound threatening but entirely hollow. I added it to the growing pile of evidence in my folder labeled Ridiculous Moves. What Penelope didn't know was that the local reporter who wrote the article was planning a follow-up. She'd reached out to me again, saying the paper had received multiple tips about similar HOA abuses in neighboring communities. Apparently, Penelope's antics weren't isolated. She had friends, or copycats, in other subdivisions who operated with the same entitlement and arrogance. The reporter hinted that the story might now grow into a broader investigation about HOA power misuse. I gave her my blessing to use whatever she needed. The more light we could shine on this, the better. That afternoon, I had a strange encounter that nearly broke the tension with laughter. A delivery man rang my doorbell holding a bouquet of flowers. At first, I thought maybe one of the neighbors had sent a thank you for helping with the HOA revolt. But the card attached was baffling. It read, "Let's settle this over coffee. No lawyers. Just neighbors. P." I stared at it for a full minute before bursting out laughing. Flowers? From Penelope? After everything? I tossed the bouquet in the compost bin without a second thought. That woman didn't want peace, she wanted submission. Later that night, I caught her on camera again. This time she wasn't sabotaging the trench, though. She was pacing in front of her house, arguing loudly on the phone. The security mic picked up bits and pieces. "They're all turning on me." I told them it wasn't a big deal. "It's just water." "He won't back down." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. Her kingdom was crumbling, and she knew it. The next day, city officials returned. This time, it wasn't just one inspector. 2 representatives from the Department of Utilities and 1 from the Legal Review Board arrived with clipboards and cameras. They reviewed the trench, traced the pipe again, and documented the hidden connections I'd uncovered. They were professional and polite, but one of them quietly told me, "We've seen this kind of thing before. But not often. And never with this level of arrogance." Meanwhile, the neighborhood was buzzing. People I'd never spoken to were waving as I passed by. One even handed me a pie. Another neighbor offered to help me finish the trench project. A few even shared plans to propose amendments to the HOA charter, rules to prevent another Penelope-style power grab. The air had changed. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a regime. But I wasn't letting my guard down. There was still time before the recall vote, and I knew Penelope wouldn't go quietly. She had 2 weeks to scheme, lie, or make some last-ditch move. I wasn't sure what that would look like, but I was prepared. The cameras were rolling, the evidence was airtight, and the law was now firmly on my side. What had started as a simple trench to fix backyard drainage had turned into an all-out war over justice, integrity, and who actually owned the ground we stood on. As I shut off the porch light that night, I looked out across my yard and saw the trench, neatly dug, professionally marked, and now a symbol of resistance. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about drawing a line that someone like Penelope couldn't cross. And by the look of things, that line was holding strong. It started raining that Monday morning, a slow, steady drizzle that made the trench glisten like a scar across the lawn. I stood at my back door with a mug of coffee, watching the water begin to trickle exactly where it should, down the gravel bed I'd laid, away from the foundation and into the designated drain path. It was working. The trench was doing its job. But outside of this one controlled space, things in the neighborhood were anything but calm. With the recall vote just days away and Penelope's grip loosening by the hour, the tension in the air had become thick enough to taste. Pete called me mid-morning with a tone I hadn't heard from him before. He wasn't excited this time, he was worried. Apparently, Penelope had called an emergency HOA meeting for that evening and was going door to door handing out flyers demanding full attendance. The wording on the flyer was aggressive, filled with warnings about disruptive neighbors, false narratives, and a threat to our community values. Pete said she was trying to rally the few remaining supporters she had, and maybe even sway the undecided. I told him I'd be there. We both knew something was coming. By the time I arrived at the clubhouse that evening, the parking lot was full. Dozens of residents crammed into the room, some standing in the back. Penelope stood at the head of the room like a politician mid-campaign, tight smile, hands folded, papers stacked neatly beside her. The moment I walked in, her smile faltered. She tried to keep talking, launching into a speech about integrity, harmony, and the spirit of our HOA. I waited. I didn't interrupt. I let her spin her story, half-lies wrapped in dramatic phrases, implying that she'd been unfairly targeted, that the pipe incident was grossly misunderstood, and that certain individuals had weaponized misinformation for personal gain. Then she opened the floor. She didn't want to, but under HOA rules, public comment had to be allowed. Pete stood up first, calm and collected, and reminded everyone of the evidence: photos, maps, video footage, and the city's findings. He didn't yell or grandstand. He simply said, "This isn't personal. It's about accountability." Then he sat down. Another neighbor stood up, a woman I didn't know well, maybe in her 60s, and described how Penelope had fined her $150 for placing a bench under her tree without approval. Others followed. Small complaints, petty grievances, but together they formed a pattern. Abuse of power. Overreach. A culture of fear. When it was my turn, I didn't even bother using the microphone. I stepped forward, held up a folder, and said, "This is the city's official report. The pipe was installed illegally. It ran through my property without permission. It bypassed a water meter and benefited one house, hers." I didn't need to say more. The room was quiet. All eyes turned to Penelope. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the tile, and launched into a tirade. She accused me of defamation, of harassment, of conspiring with city officials. She claimed I'd doctored the photos. When someone in the crowd asked her to show proof that the pipe was ever legally installed, she ignored them. When another asked why the irrigation system only serviced her yard, she snapped and said, "Because I paid for it." The room went silent. Then someone in the back muttered, "Exactly." The meeting broke down after that. Penelope tried to regain control, but it was over. She left abruptly, slamming the clubhouse door behind her. Pete and a few others stayed behind to finalize the paperwork for the recall vote, which was now guaranteed to happen. The residents were angry, yes, but more than that, they were embarrassed. Embarrassed that one person had been allowed to bully and manipulate for so long. Embarrassed that they'd stayed quiet. But that was changing. 2 days later, Penelope made one last move. I should have seen it coming, but part of me had hoped she'd accept the outcome with some level of grace. Instead, I came home to find a notice stapled, yes, stapled, to a wooden stake driven into my lawn. It claimed that due to my continued defiance and willful disruption, the HOA was enacting an emergency suspension of my community privileges. I had been, according to her, temporarily removed from all HOA voting and participation rights. It was nonsense, of course. HOA rules required a board majority to enact disciplinary action, and with 2 members already gone and Pete now acting interim chair, she had no authority to do anything. Still, the visual of that ridiculous sign on my lawn was enough to make me shake my head in disbelief. I pulled it out, took a photo, and sent it directly to the city attorney, who was still following the case. The reply was swift, documented. Recommend no action on your part. Her actions are bordering on retaliatory harassment. That same day, I received word that the city was preparing a formal violation notice against Penelope herself, not just for the illegal water line, but for obstruction and unauthorized modifications to utility infrastructure. It wasn't just civil anymore. It was becoming criminal. Then came the final straw. Around midnight that evening, My security camera caught her sneaking into my yard again. She wasn't alone this time. A man, possibly a contractor or handyman, followed her with a toolbox. They went straight to the trench area, crouched down, and began messing with the exposed pipe. Within seconds, the cameras triggered the floodlights. They both froze. I stepped out onto the porch and calmly said, "Smile, you're being recorded." Penelope's face turned ghost white. The man bolted. She stood frozen for a second, then turned and ran. I called the police. Not as a bluff, but because I knew this time the footage alone would be enough for charges. The officers arrived quickly, reviewed the footage, and shook their heads. One of them said, "She's escalating. This is her 4th report in 2 months." I handed them a flash drive with the security footage, and gave my statement. They promised to include it in the case file and recommended I seek a protective order if she returned again. The following morning, the recall vote took place. Residents lined up outside the clubhouse, more than I'd ever seen at any meeting or event in the neighborhood. People were polite, quiet, and serious. The ballots were counted publicly. Out of 82 eligible households, 74 voted for removal. Penelope was officially recalled. Her title stripped, her access revoked, and in a poetic twist of fate, her home was now under city review for unauthorized utility alterations, with potential fines in the thousands. Pete was voted in as the new president. His first act? Introducing an amendment requiring board approval for any infrastructure changes, property inspections, or community rule modifications. No more one-woman rule. The neighborhood clapped when he read it aloud. Even those who had stayed silent before now stood and cheered. Something had shifted. We were no longer a community run by fear. We were neighbors again. That afternoon, I finished filling in the trench. The illegal pipe was now capped and documented. The drainage system was complete. As I shoveled the last bit of gravel into place, Pete walked over and handed me a small, weatherproof plaque. It read, "This yard defended more than just a lawn." I smiled, shook his hand, and placed it near the newly planted hydrangeas along the edge. The irony didn't escape me. Penelope had once screamed about her dying hydrangeas. Mine were now thriving. As dusk settled over the neighborhood, sprinklers hissed to life in the distance, this time from meters legally installed. The sound was clean, honest, and strangely satisfying. I didn't win anything flashy. There was no trophy, no news van waiting to interview the local hero. But I had defended my home. And in doing so, I helped my neighbors realize they didn't have to live under the rule of someone who only ever cared about control. And that, to me, was worth every shovel of dirt. It would have been easy to think it was over after the vote, but with someone like Penelope, closure didn't come that cleanly. The neighborhood had changed, yes. People smiled more now. Kids played on front lawns without their parents nervously glancing at their mailboxes, worried about fines for sidewalk chalk. New flower beds sprang up that didn't match the HOA's old palette guide. And for the first time in years, people planted things because they liked them, not because they were community approved. But even with the transformation happening around us, a quiet tension lingered, because Penelope was still living among us, still simmering behind her pristine white shutters and watching everything through those heavy floral curtains like a dethroned monarch in exile. A week after the recall, I got a letter. This one came by certified mail and had the official letterhead of a law firm I'd never heard of. I opened it on my porch, half expecting it to be another empty threat. But this one was real, a notice of intent to file a civil suit alleging emotional distress, defamation, property interference, and a slew of other vague claims. The letter was signed by Penelope's attorney and requested a settlement meeting to avoid a lengthy and costly court proceeding. I chuckled and shook my head, but not out of disbelief. It was just exhausting at this point. She was so desperate to win something, anything, that now she was hoping to squeeze money out of me through pure intimidation. I called my cousin at the law firm downtown, The same one who helped me draft the original cease and desist. He reviewed the letter, laughed twice, then got serious. He explained that while the case had no real foundation, I should still prepare for the nuisance. Penelope was counting on me, folding under pressure, hoping I'd pay her just to make the noise go away. But I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. We drafted a formal response rejecting the settlement and including a counter-warning. If she continued with malicious litigation, we'd file a harassment claim along with evidence of trespassing, unauthorized modifications to public utilities, and repeated attempts to manipulate an HOA system for personal gain. That response must have rattled her. Days passed, and no further legal threats came. But then, as always, she pivoted. Penelope had always been good at controlling perception. With the legal route crumbling, she turned to sympathy. A new flyer appeared in every mailbox, written in her signature cursive font. It was titled "My Side of the Story," and was filled with claims of being bullied, of living in fear, and of being the victim of a targeted vendetta. She claimed she was a retired teacher who had only ever wanted to beautify the neighborhood, and was now being publicly shamed for minor misunderstandings. She included a list of her so-called community contributions, from organizing potlucks to personally watering neglected lawns, which now had an entirely different meaning. The reaction was mixed. Some of the older residents felt sorry for her and told me they thought she'd suffered enough. But the majority weren't buying it. People remembered the fines, the threats, the HOA meetings she ran like courtrooms. Sympathy dried up when a neighbor quietly reminded everyone that Penelope once fined a man for having a slightly cracked garden gnome. Another reminded us of the Halloween where she'd confiscated decorations for being too pagan. No one had forgotten, most had just been too afraid to speak up until now. But then came the final blow, one Penelope never saw coming. The city's investigation had been thorough, and just after the neighborhood began settling back into its rhythm, official charges were filed. The letter arrived on my porch first, a courtesy copy of the municipal filing. Penelope had been cited for unauthorized water diversion, tampering with utility infrastructure, and obstruction of a municipal investigation. It wasn't jail time, not yet, but it came with hefty fines and mandatory city supervision of her property for 6 months. She was also barred from holding any position in any HOA or community board within the city limits for the foreseeable future. The news broke across the community like a flash fire. Someone posted a photo of the city officer taping the violation notice to her door. Another neighbor walked past and saw her peeking through the blinds, unmoving. The once mighty president who had threatened fines over mailbox colors now had her own yard under surveillance for code violations. It was poetic. And somehow, even that wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, a small group of residents approached me about something new. They wanted to amend the HOA charter permanently. Not just to add oversight, but to rewrite it completely. To reduce fines, limit board powers, and require public consent for major policy changes. They asked if I would help. I didn't hesitate. Over the next few days, we drafted proposals, gathered support, and organized a town hall that wasn't mandatory or hostile, but casual, hosted in someone's driveway, with burgers, folding chairs, and a whiteboard propped on an easel. It felt like a neighborhood again. We called it the Rebuild Plan. And it passed unanimously. A few of the old board members even came back just to vote in favor. We had new bylaws, new protections, and for the first time in our HOA's history, transparency. Everything was published online. All meetings were open. No more backroom decisions. It felt like a new era, and people started stepping up to be part of something instead of hiding from it. As for Penelope, she sold her house 2 months later. The listing was quiet. No open house, no goodbye notes. One morning, a moving truck pulled up. By sunset, she was gone. A few neighbors stood on the sidewalk watching as her luxury white SUV disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a house no longer feared, just another home. The new family that moved in was kind, friendly, and completely unaware of the war that had taken place under their new roof. I didn't tell them. Some battles don't need to be passed on. On a warm evening not long after, I stood in the backyard looking over the space where it had all started. The trench was now grassed over, the drainage system flowing smoothly beneath. I'd planted a row of sunflowers along the edge where the pipe used to run, not for decoration, but as a quiet reminder. Pete stopped by and handed me a small wooden plaque. It had been made by one of the neighbors, engraved with the words, "This yard helped break the silence." I didn't need the recognition, but I appreciated the gesture. Life returned to normal, only it was better than it had ever been. The fear was gone. The control was gone. What remained was something stronger than either: community. People no longer whispered about the HOA, they joked about it. When someone mentioned the trench, it was met with laughter instead of hushed tones. The memory had become legend, and legend had become strength. A single pipe, buried in secret, had managed to reveal everything wrong with how one person had twisted power for years. But more importantly, it showed us how to take that power back. Sometimes battles are fought in courtrooms or through speeches or on ballot. But sometimes, all it takes is one person with a shovel, a camera, and the unwillingness to look the other way. That was my part in this, and if I ever had to do it again, I wouldn't hesitate, because now I know that silence gives power to the wrong people. But truth, especially when it's dug up in your own backyard, is impossible to bury again.